Welcome to In Reality, the podcast about truth, disinformation, and the media. I'm Eric Schurenberg, longtime journalist and media executive, now the founder of the Alliance for Trust in Media. Up to this point, my assumption about artificial intelligence, and I'm not alone in this, my assumption has been that it will only make the information environment worse, more chaotic, more polluted by mass-produced slop that only reinforces our partisan belief bubbles. Add to that the scary possibility that AI would become a superhuman tool of political manipulation, able to strike up one-on-one conversations with voters about whom the AI knows everything, and the AI could then win them over with subtle manipulation. Now, it so happens that 3 scientific papers have come out just last week that challenge this alarming scenario. All concluded that AI models in conversation are indeed much more persuasive than conventional methods used to sway voters, like, say, political ads. But they're effective not because they're especially manipulative, but because they're better at marshaling facts to support their case. Today's guest is Kobi Hackenburg, an Oxford PhD candidate who authored one of the papers I just referred to and who has long studied the question of AI's power to change minds. Among other things, Kobi and I will dig deeper into why factuality works so well in these experiments and other more insidious techniques like micro-targeting don't work. We'll speculate about how AI might be used by political campaigns in the future and whether we should be cheered that, at least in this experiment, people seemed surprisingly open to changing their minds when confronted with contrary facts. And now here's Kobi Hackenburg. Kobi Hackenburg, welcome to In Reality.
Thanks so much for having me, Eric. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's nice to have you. You know, I would say that most people up to this moment who are concerned about AI and politics are concerned about things like AI flooding people's news feeds with slop or deep fakes that give the wrong impression about how politicians behave or what they might have said. But today we're going to talk about an even more potentially insidious use of AI to engage in conversation with voters via chatbots and change their minds. Now, you personally have worked on or have studied yourself 3 recent experiments that in different ways tested that possibility. So just to get the listeners oriented, in a sentence, could you summarize the findings of those experiments? Briefly put, can AI persuade voters to change their minds?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the focus of my PhD work at Oxford, and it's purely studying the persuasive capabilities of AI systems and AI language models. Um, so I've been working on this for a few years now, and I think the short answer to your question is that absolutely, these systems are very persuasive, and they can persuade people and change their minds on a wide range of political issues.
Now, are they more persuasive than, say, AI-generated ads or human-generated political ads?
Yeah, so this is an evolving area of research I'm working on. I've done a few studies testing, static vignettes, the messages that are similar to those you might find in a newsletter, an email, a social media post. We recruited political consultants to write some vignettes for us, persuading on a couple issues, like deportations, I think, immigration, things like this, and then had AI generate equivalent vignettes. And we tested these in an RCT and found that they were broadly equivalent in terms of the persuasive impact they had. Now, it's a lot of people, and myself included, suspect that the advantage of AI will only grow when you move from a static chunk of text to a multi-turn dynamic conversation, which has sort of more degrees of freedom, I guess you could say, where the AI at each conversational turn will be able to access and deploy, far more facts and information than maybe a human canvasser would be able to, for example.
Okay, so just to orient us, if you were a campaign manager,
Mhm.
would you, on the basis of your research, be trying desperately to figure out how to use chatbots in your campaign to influence voters?
Yeah, I mean, I'd definitely be looking at it. I'd definitely be considering it. I think there's a real gap, and maybe we'll get more to this later, between the current research we've been doing now, which is all in lab settings,
Hmm.
where participants are sort of incentivized and paid to take these experiments, where we expose them to persuasive treatment materials, maybe generated by AI or maybe generated by humans, versus in the real world, where
Hmm.
people have many competing demands for their attention. And many folks might not want to actually sit down and engage in a very information dense 10-minute conversation with an AI chatbot about a political issue. So the challenge for the campaign managers of today who might be interested in using these AI technologies is like, how do I get people to engage and how pay attention and talk to my very persuasive chatbot when they might not want to?
Same issue faced by every podcast host uh, in the world. So let's talk briefly about the three experiments that we're talking about. Sort of in general terms, how did they do this test of chatbots' persuasiveness?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe I'll talk recently about this, what we have, the science paper, which just came out this week,
Hmm.
which tries to measure and map a bunch of different factors which may drive or shape the persuasiveness
Okay.
of these AI systems. Basically, in this experiment, what we did is collect a huge sample of political issues, so maybe 700 or so. These were ranging from things like, the UK should develop the green belt to land, to, we should change the pension age, or things like that. All sorts of political issues
Of interest to UK voters.
of interest to UK voters. So many of these came from YouGov, essentially. So these were issues that were actually, people were being polled on by real pollsters and
Mhm.
things like that. And then we took a very wide range of language models and tried to get people to be persuaded, essentially, by these models to believe more or agree more with the position that they were assigned. And broadly, we found a couple things. So, without getting too technical here, like one thing people are really concerned about with these models is that as they get bigger and bigger, as the models have been getting, and they're trained with
Mhm.
more and more compute and more data, what does this mean for their persuasiveness? Does this mean they'll just keep getting more and more persuasive as each new, larger model is released? We test models ranging from very, very small to very, very large. And what we try to show is the relationship, what we call the scaling curve, the scaling law of persuasion with AI systems. And what we show is that as the models get bigger and bigger, they do, in fact, get more and more persuasive. But what's really interesting is we show that even a model that's about 100 times the size of the largest model currently existing today, this such a model, our best statistical prediction is that it would be something like 3 percentage points more persuasive than today's models.
Hmm. Hmm.
This 3 percentage points is also the difference we observe between two different deployments of essentially what is ChatGPT, OpenAI's flagship model, which is the same base model in all likelihood, just with different what's called post training, different fine tuning, different particular behavioral training the model has received right at the end before release. And so in subsequent experiments, what we test is training these models, fine tuning them on validated examples of persuasive conversations to see, well, okay, we've seen that, model scaling gives you such and such a persuasive advantage. But what if you train the models explicitly on these persuasive conversations? And what we show is that if you do this, even very small models can be raised up to be as persuasive as current frontier models.
Okay, Kobe, let me stop you there. So the one implication from that I would immediately glom onto is that the biggest AI players at the moment that have the most power to invest and scale up their models, add on more compute, throw in more data, don't necessarily have a built-in advantage over lighter weight models that are trained on persuasive technique. Is that correct? And if so, what does that imply for sort of the information environment around political campaigns?
Yeah, so it does seem to be correct from in terms of the results that we show in this paper. I think what we show is that even these models, which are open source, which anyone can access,
Mhm.
um, even if they're very, very small, if you have the right data and train them correctly, you can dramatically increase their persuasiveness. And so what this means is that to the extent that that remains the case, even if these frontier AI developers decided, we don't want our models being used for political persuasion, we're going to, put a stop to it, add some sort of filter or safety training that prevents models from complying with these sorts of requests. If you're an actor, a campaign manager, or someone who's interested in sort of deploying persuasive AI systems, this wouldn't really stop you from reaching that frontier AI persuasion effect, because these models are also widely pervasive that anyone can really find them and access them.
Okay. All right. So to use a non-technical term, the cat is out of the bag in terms of this. There's no
Yeah.
bottleneck in terms of capacity that that would prevent these from being widely used in the political arena. One of the things that struck me about the papers was that the strongest persuasive technique was marshaling a lot of facts. So information density, as you described it in the paper, that conventional wisdom that I have been bound by for a couple of years since I got interested in this topic is that people are restrained by things like confirmation bias and motivated reasoning, and so are expert at ignoring inconvenient facts. And the result is of which fact checking and facts themselves are not generally persuasive. Why did your results differ from that conventional view?
Yeah, so that's a great point, and that's exactly sort of the sort of surprise or the discussions I was having with my co-authors when we discovered this. I think there's sort of an emerging body of literature, recently in the past few years that actually, in spite of all this work, which you correctly reference on motivated reasoning and sort of, people's attitudes only being central to their identity and not really movable by facts and evidence. Actually, there's been a bunch of experiments, not just ours, which have shown that broadly, if you expose people to high quality facts and evidence, they will update their beliefs in the direction of the treatment that they were shown.
Hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, as you say, this sort of is a direct contradiction of that sort of work, and shows, maybe optimistically that, people can be, persuaded and update their beliefs, even if they disagree with the issue they're trying to be persuaded on. And we show this in our paper quite, convincingly, I think, and repeatedly, which is that, across all of these persuasion strategies that we tried, the performance of the persuasion strategy was really well predicted by how information dense the model was when deploying that strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And we show that, repeatedly across. And I know you mentioned there's going to be another paper released by Dave Rand and House Lin in Nature. And they find the same thing in a multi-country study on vote choice, where they conduct this knockout experiment where they have a condition where they tell the model, to stop using facts. And as soon as the model stops using facts, its persuasive impact is dramatically decreased or diminished. Yeah.
This is really remarkable, and I'm inclined, like you just mentioned, to think that this is an optimistic finding. But I wonder if it is to reflect an earlier point that you made about the laboratory setting is going to be different from perhaps
Yeah.
changing people's minds in real life. Do you think that this is a lab effect, that people who signed up for this are aware that they are, in an experiment about changing their minds, and they might be prompted to be more open to that?
It's quite possible that the magnitude of the effects we observe are sort of uniformly inflated as a result of some sort of lab effect.
Mhm.
We certainly can't rule that out. And that brings back to the point I raised earlier about, the extent to which these results will translate to the real world in field studies. I do think, though, that it's quite interesting because the rhetorical strategies that some people thought would work the best, even things like personalization, where we, deploy, give the model beforehand lots of information about the person, and give them information, their free text, opinions that we collect before the study, give them all of this, train models on this data to try to exploit it more effectively. Even a technique like this yielded a fraction of the benefit of this information effect. And so I'm inclined to believe that, even if there is some, lab effect in terms of, uniformly inflating in absolute terms, the treatment effects we observe. There does seem to be this really strong signal that when the model deploys information or facts, we just saw wildly larger persuasive impact.
Let's dig a little deeper in the personalization
Yeah.
strategy. It's one that is intuitively convincing. It's long been part of the handbook of, say, Cialdini's articles of persuasion, and also those of us who remember the Cambridge Analytica scandal. The fear there was that AI would be used to micro-target audiences, and out of that, find everybody's particular political hot buttons, and then AI would be able to push them. But that's not what you found. And was personalization, among all the other kinds of persuasive tactics you used, at least more powerful than others? Or did the persuasive power of it just kind of dissipate in this setting?
Yeah. So I mean, it's really interesting because I think, we observe our treatment effects. We measured people's attitudes on a 0 to 100 scale, and so we measured persuasion by, how far could the model push someone towards 100 given where they started on the 0 to 100 scale. And what we found is that across all of our various personalization interventions, on average, compared to a generic case where the model received no information about the person they were trying to persuade,
Hmm.
that the additional benefit of employing even our most sophisticated personalization techniques was something like half a percentage point.
Wow. Wow.
So it was significant, statistically significant. So it
Mhm.
definitely did help, but the amount that it helped was very small. This is, I think, we report these facts in the paper, but I think we estimate that like every additional fact checkable claim that the model deployed also increased the persuasive effect by about half a percentage point. And so all of this personalization we were doing was functionally equivalent to using just one additional fact,
One more fact.
which was
That
pretty striking for us. Yeah.
that is remarkable. Well, one of the other things that struck me about this is related. There's a third paper that talks about AI's ability, AI, persuasive chatbots' ability to separate people from conspiracy theories and other kind of deeply held false beliefs. It struck me that people with that kind of belief system are exposed to countervailing facts all the time. By definition, your conspiracy theories is an outlier, and so there's a conventional theory that it contradicts yours. In the atmosphere, in the very atmosphere. Why do you suppose, in that case, I know this wasn't your paper, but why do you suppose that in this case, the experiments, the chatbots were more successful at countermanding conspiracy theories?
It's a really good question, and I'm sure Dave would have more interesting things to say because it's a great paper with Tom Costello also. I think one sort of mechanism that I sort of suspect plays a role in this is that, when you're being exposed, you might, you're scrolling on social media, you might see a debunk, piece of information that debunks your view, but you scroll past it. I think in
Mm,
these experiments where people are sitting down and, they've decided they're going to have a conversation about this, the model can just really, pull and deploy and sort of artfully and gracefully, weave together a bunch of different evidence that refutes your view, but in a way that's very, elegant and easy to read and non-confrontational. And it synthesizes it all, in real time, in the space of a real conversation, in a way that humans probably would really struggle to do.
mm,
Um,
mm.
and so I do think that these experimental treatments are just a really strong, it's an experience that people, even in the wild, even though they're exposed to the countermanding evidence, wouldn't necessarily have had.
I mean, it's obvious, kind of self-evident that when you're being ridiculed or being told that you're wrong, kind of upfront, your defenses go up, and you would be less likely to be in a persuadable state of mind. How long were these? You described the conversations as multi-turn. How long were they in terms of minutes?
Yeah. So I think on average, so they were between 2 and 10 turns was sort of the upper and lower bounds we set. Participants could leave in the middle after two turns whenever they felt like the conversation had reached a natural stopping place.
Hmm.
On average, we saw the conversations lasted about 7 turns, meaning that the AI sent 7 messages and the persuadee sent 7 messages.
Mm-hmm.
Um, this ended up being on average 9 minutes.
All right. So hence your description of the 10-minute sitting down and having a 10-minute conversation.
Yes,
Um, One of the problems with large language models, as everybody knows, is that they make up facts, often quite confidently, but still make them up out of thin air. Did the chatbots in these experiments hallucinate in that way? And if they did they get more persuasive by making up facts or less?
that's a great question. We can answer some of those. The answer is, I mean, they definitely did say things that weren't truthful. It's difficult to say if this was a hallucination or if this was something that model was, this was something that emerged, deterministically out of the model's, weights, or like the model thought that saying this would be more persuasive, and
Mm.
not to use anthropomorphic language, but like it wanted to say it. It was doing it on purpose, so to speak. This definitely was the case. So we extracted every fact checkable claim made by the models in our experiments. So, and on the order of 500,000 fact checkable claims. We hired professional fact checkers to help us build to validate essentially an AI powered fact checker, which would take each fact checkable claim, go on the internet, look up facts, try to figure out if it was true or false. And then, yeah, we had these professional human fact checkers also, do this for a subset so we could validate that our fact checker was actually working. What we found is that on average, the AI models, especially sort of the large frontier models, the information they provided was broadly accurate. So I think we rated every fact on a 0 to 100, true to false, or false to true scale,
Hmm.
where 100 is totally true. I think the average was, I think, somewhere around like 77 or 80. So broadly good. But what we did find, which was really interesting, is that across all of the different things we tried to make the models more persuasive, like training them to be persuasive, prompting them to be persuasive, these factors also systematically decreased the accuracy of the claims that the models would make in these persuasive conversations.
Hmm.
So I think there's two possible explanations for this finding. One explanation, as you say, is that when the models say untrue things, this is more persuasive because untrue things are more persuasive than true things. The other explanation is that as we prompt the models to be more persuasive, or as we train the models to be more persuasive, maybe something is happening where, for example, the model is learning, okay, I should add more facts to these conversations because facts are persuasive. And I am learning that, when I give more facts, the person is more persuaded. But in doing so, the models start to run out of, true facts. And so there's this effect, which we sort of call the bottom of the barrel effect, where the model starts
Mm.
scraping the bottom of the barrel of the facts that it can deploy. And so they start getting a bit dodgy.
Mm. Mm.
Um, and so by the, 12th or 13th fact, maybe we're starting to see that they're not quite so high quality as they used to be. And either one of these is, a very plausible explanation for the data, I think.
That sounds like a very human temptation as well in an argument. One of the studies, and I forget which, noted that this tendency to, or maybe a better way to put it, was that the inaccurate claims were more persuasive with people of a conservative political orientation. I probably didn't state that exactly right, but I'm curious, what is the correct interpretation of that finding, and what do you think accounted for it?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't recognize that claim from any paper that I've done. I think that might be from some work from Dave Rand and maybe in their recent
Mm.
Nature paper.
Mhm.
So I can't speculate, I'm afraid, on why they found that, or what the case would be. I think I will say that in our work, I haven't found any particular sort of partisan differences of that nature.
Okay.
Um, but I agree with you that it is interesting, and it does seem like, it might be the case that we do find some of these things, as we move forward with this sort of research agenda.
Okay. That just kind of stepping back now to the sort of overall implications of what you found. should we be encouraged or worried? Earlier we said, well, maybe it's encouraging that people are more open to factuality and factual arguments than we thought, or maybe it's worrisome that people actually can have their minds changed by chatbots that are in the service of politicians who may not have their best interests in mind or really only are focused on winning. What do you think?
It's a really interesting question, and I think actually a really complicated question and a really interesting one. I think there's a temptation with this line of research for people to immediately and correctly see the risks and the potential harms, and the ways in which people can be manipulated or deceived, and that's certainly the case that we shouldn't be naive to those risks. But persuasion is as you say, it's a unique sort of thing, and that it's really not inherently good or bad. And it's actually the case that persuasion is a central feature of democracy. And there's lots, it's the way that we form our political opinions and talk to each other to reach collective decisions. And it's sort of how democracy works. And so, when you view it through that lens, I mean, the existence of machines which can persuade effectively becomes to feel sort of more like a neutral thing, which, you could imagine a case where these chatbots are really powerful in helping explain to people, complex political issues, helping them see how issues, speak to problems in their own lives,
Hmm.
are, reliable and accessible forms of political information. I mean, I do think all of that is very possible and achievable. So, in a sense, I feel, obligated sometimes to remind people of that, or underscore that point as well, that, we're talking about, something that's so foundational, so central to, so many processes that we care about and institutions we care about, that it's not clear to me that this is immediately just going to undermine and sort of distort or destroy, in the worst case, for example, the integrity of elections, or the ability of people to trust information, or converse with other people online, for fear that they might be AI bots trying to persuade them.
Hmm.
These all are real risks, and we'll study them. But I think to put it in a sentence, I think my view is that we've seen the information environment and the political communication environment and the political persuasion landscape transformed repeatedly by new technologies, from radio and television to social media and now these AI systems. And I guess my view is, optimistically, that we'll be able to, with rigorous research and careful attention, be able to respond, to the challenges AI presents in a similar sort of way, and hopefully even more gracefully than we have with some these technologies in the past.
You've mentioned other technological advancements that changed the electoral landscape and radio to social media. Um, the changes were enormous. A television being another one that certainly changed the nature of political discourse. Do you see AI and chatbots in this sort of potential persuasive mode as being like a quantum leap in campaign organization and execution, or is it just an incremental change?
I feel that these are unquestionably really powerful technologies, and really remarkable technologies, and I do think they will transform political campaigning. I think there's very real questions, though, which get back to the points we talked about already earlier, about how people end up engaging with these chatbots and how they end up being deployed, um,
Mm.
in contexts like political campaigns. A lot of people in 2024, everyone was really concerned about AI, and how it was going to influence this big year of elections that we had around the world. And I think now, looking back, the consensus was broadly, it didn't play much of a role at all. And so I think there's always, if in the moment it always feels like, you know, it could be that everything changes in a blink of an eye. But I think often, and at least in 2024, it was the case that the real deployment and realization of the impacts that these technologies will have actually does just take time to manifest.
Mm.
And it takes time to build tools. It takes time to people adjust to for example, being comfortable talking to a chatbot about who they should vote for. Um, And so I think the real, in the next few years, we'll really see and get a better sense of the scale of the transformation. Currently, my hunch is that a quantum leap might be too much. I don't know if I'd quite say quantum leap,
Hmm.
maybe just large leap.
Largely, I'll go with that. Does your research suggest any kind of guardrails that democracies might want to put up around this technology?
It's an interesting question because, as we've just said, sometimes persuasion is good, and you don't
Right.
want people, you don't want to have an intervention that just shuts people off to new information because as we said, it's actually great when people update in the face of information, most of the time, maybe even. I think the sorts of interventions that my work would suggest would be the most helpful is just maybe technical solutions around training factuality into AI systems. And this is
Mhm.
a really difficult, thorny, multidimensional, technical and socio-technical challenge of how do you get the AI to not, say things that aren't true, but of course this is problems we've been having with social media and all the technologies that came before. Who gets to decide what's true? And certainly people don't agree about that. There's going to be some models which have certain tendencies or certain behaviors that have been trained into them by their developers. There'll be other models that have the opposite. And so I think probably what we'll see is that it's not so easy for a single mitigation or intervention to sort of solve this inaccuracy problem. But I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I'm curious what you think as well. I mean, we've seen this problem already, even with news media, like, people self-select into news that they, prefer. And this might be the case with chatbots as well, where you have different chatbots with different opinions on political issues that people prefer over others.
Well, I would say that what you've just described in terms of training bots and large language models to be accurate reminds me of training young journalists to be able to decipher truth from falsehood and spin from factuality, because in my profession, you're always being spun. So that is a challenge we faced on the human level, and within parameters of human nature, it seems to have been solved by journalistic institutions that care about their reputation. So I would say that that seems manageable. I say that in total ignorance of the technological challenge of doing that. But I am encouraged that factuality and a kind of steady, um, as you said, graceful and polite, if that's an accurate word to use for an AI model, laying out of the facts can actually change minds. That is a really novel but very hopeful development.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think it's really interesting what you say there about training young journalists. I think that the folks building these sorts of systems, the machine learning engineers, the data scientists, probably could really learn a lot from people like you and the other folks who have been training these journalists and who have real insights about how to get people to do well at this task. I think that's probably an expertise that's really missing. And so yeah, it would be interesting. I'm sure my best vision of what we could do to solve this problem would be to collaborate and get folks like you and the other folks who are teaching these journalists to help build a curriculum that the technical folks can then translate into a training regime to put these systems through. It's maybe too technical to discuss now, but I do think that it's totally possible, and this is actually how model behaviors are structured and trained. Is humans build these taxonomies.
Mhm.
Right now it's these machine learning engineers, and build these data sets with desired outputs and reasoning chains and traces, and these are what the model is then trained on. And I think probably speculation, of course, but I guess that a lot of the expertise that you referenced there is not something that's currently um, being explicitly coached into these models, at least not with the level of expertise that I think definitely exists from your field.
Well, that is, speaking as a long time, not to say recovering journalist, that is an optimistic note for us all. And so why don't we leave it there? Kobi, it's really, really nice to talk to you. And this work is fascinating. And, I am for once leaving a conversation about AI in the current information environment more optimistic than I entered it, which is an achievement.
That's great. Well, I guess whether I've done my job there depends on how pessimistic you were initially. There are still risks, I will say,
All
of
right.
course. But it
Good
was
to keep that.
wonderful. Yeah, it was great to be here, and yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thanks very much. And that's a wrap. I can't help but feel a bit optimistic to hear, at least in this instance, that voters are willing to change their minds about candidates and issues. And this, comes from years of hearing that most people are emotionally wrapped up in their beliefs and impossible to persuade otherwise. Now, it's just one data point, of course, but it seems worth pursuing. I'd like to know how else the models interacted with the humans they were speaking to so that the humans were open to the facts. Maybe a topic for another episode. In Reality is a production of the Alliance for Trust in Media. Thanks to Kobi Hackenburg of Oxford's Internet Institute for the work he's doing on this topic, and thanks to our producer Tom Platz of Sound Sapien, and to my colleague Sophia Campbell of the Alliance. If you like the work we're doing, give us a positive comment on Apple or Spotify or YouTube or wherever you're reaching us, and share us with a friend. I'm Eric Schurenberg. Thanks for joining me in Reality.